You are listening to Proof Text, a Glossa House podcast exploring Scripture and all things related to it. New episodes are released daily. For more information, check out glossahouse.com and subscribe to our channels on Spotify and YouTube. Welcome and enjoy.
Shalom and welcome to this week's episode of SLA Insights. I'm Dr. Jennifer Noonan, and I have with me here a special guest, Dr. Travis West, who is Associate Professor of Hebrew and Old Testament at Western Theological Seminary in Holland, Michigan. So thank you for joining us. It's great to have you visiting to be interviewed here.
It's really delightful to be here with you, Jen. Thanks so much for the invitation.
My pleasure. So as we get started, maybe if you could tell us just a little bit about your education and background, and then we'll get into what you do.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm born and raised in Michigan, and I went to Calvin College, which is now Calvin University in Grand Rapids. And when I was growing up, I really wasn't all that interested in school. I was more interested in sports and hanging out with people. But when I went to college and realized that kind of approach was going to be costly in the end, I actually discovered a love of studying Bible and theology in college. But I had no intention or sense of calling to pastoral ministry, despite the fact that my mom told me when I was a kid that I would grow up to be a pastor like my uncle. And I said to her many times, Mom, there are two professions I will never have. I will never be a teacher, and I will never be a preacher. And in the delightful irony of God, I'm now ordained as a minister and a professor and teacher in the seminary. But so when I was at Calvin, I discovered this love of studying the Bible and theology and felt this call to continue studying in seminary. And so, but because I didn't want to be a preacher and I was absolutely terrified of taking the biblical languages, another irony asterisk in my story, I wanted to just get an MA and not have to do with the languages, but I was counseled to get a Master of Divinity and to struggle through the languages. So I went to Western Theological Seminary as a student, where I'm now teaching. And it was there that I discovered this passion and love of the Hebrew language and the Old Testament. And in that same process, kind of discerned a call that I wanted to kind of spend my life's energy pursuing studying and teaching the Hebrew Bible.
That's great. That's great. Cool. So you have recently published your dissertation, which I finished reading myself and have really enjoyed.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, very good. The Art of Biblical Performance. So tell us about it. What's it about? What do you present? Maybe some examples.
Sure. Yeah. So this started as a master's thesis in 2009 when I was studying at Western, got a master's of theology. And the whole my introduction to performance as an interpretive method was kind of from one person, really, my former colleague and mentor and dear friend, Tom Bogart, was this kind of very just original, creative professor. And he's the one who got me interested in and invited me to learn about this whole embodied, interactive, communicative way of teaching Hebrew. And at the same time, introduced me to this idea of performance. And he developed it with a colleague of his from Northwestern College in Orange City, Iowa, who's a theater professor. And so as a theater professor and playwright and the Old Testament professor, they kind of came together and developed this process for interpreting Old Testament stories through performance. And unbeknownst to us, kind of doing this in West Michigan and Northwestern Iowa, there was a group that had been for many years already at that point doing biblical performance criticism in the academy. And when I started to do my THM thesis on performance, I discovered this whole sort of corpus of literature that was still very much in its infancy at the time. And so got connected with the biblical performance criticism group at the Society of Biblical Literature, and discovered all this great content. And so after finishing my THM, then when I did my PhD at the Free University in Amsterdam, I wanted to expand on all of that. And so basically what I did in the dissertation is divided into two parts. So the first half is kind of theoretical, historical, cultural foundation of performance within the context of ancient Israel. And then the second half is really just a demonstration. They're just exegetical chapters demonstrating what kinds of insights biblical performance criticism makes possible to someone who approaches the texts as a performer or an actor, as opposed to just a silent reader.
Right, great. And so just give us an example, some of the exegetical insights that you gain.
Yeah, so when you're approaching the text as a script and as a performer, you just bring a whole different set of questions to the text than a reader would. So, for instance, in my Hebrew class, we have our students perform the binding of Isaac every year from Genesis 22. It's one of their kind of capstone projects at the end of the year. And a question that comes up every single year is, how does Isaac get off the altar? Now, if you're just reading the story straight through, you just sort of take it as it presents it to you, which says, Abraham bound Isaac and laid him on the altar on top of the wood, stretched his hand out, grabbed the knife to slaughter his son, and the angel says, don't do it. He raises his eyes, sees the ram, and offers the ram instead of his son. Okay, great. That's beautiful. Isaac is saved. Hooray. But when you're the character playing Isaac and you're bound and laying on the chair or the floor or whatever, pretending to be on an altar, and Abraham is dragging the ram over, you ask the question, how do I get off the altar, right? It's in performance, that question is unavoidable. And it's a narrative gap in the story. The narrator in the story doesn't tell you how that happens. And so the most logical conclusion would be Abraham is standing there with a knife in his hand and Isaac is bound. And so Abraham just can take the knife and cut the ropes and either help Isaac off, or perhaps Isaac, who's traumatized, scampers off and kind of hides away from Abraham, doesn't really understand what's going on. There's lots of ways to play that. But what you discover is kind of universal biblical reversal, that the instrument that was intended to destroy Isaac becomes the instrument of his liberation. And that kind of just deepens the connections between the binding of Isaac story and the Good Friday story, right, of Jesus on the cross in the New Testament. There's lots of connections between those two stories, but that one is only in the gaps, and performance sort of helps expose those. I could give you dozens more, but that one took longer than it should have, so I'll just leave it at one. But there's lots more, and in the book, I offer a lot of examples peppered throughout.
Yeah, that's great, and it's so enriching. In a way that you might not realize.
Yeah. I mean, another thing that it does is it fundamentally changes your relationship with the text as the interpreter. so much of the history of biblical scholarship, particularly maybe in the last 150 or 200 years, is really about exerting mastery over the text and holding the text kind of at arm's length. And
Mm-hmm.
it's about analysis and dissection and finding, J source or E source or whatever, right?
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
performance, because part of the process is internalizing the text, you get the text inside of yourself, and you do that in order to get yourself inside the text.
Mm-hmm.
And so the text then becomes a world, it's a subject that you have a back and forth relationship with that's not mastery, but more intimacy and give and take, as opposed to the Bible being an object that you apply exegetical tools to and dissect it or something. Because of course in that scenario, when the Bible is something that gets dissected, the Bible is dead.
Right.
Right? You only
Right.
dissect things that are dead, and
Right.
that's just not a great metaphor for the Bible, which claims to be
Yeah.
living and active. So
Right. Yes. And even for, as you had mentioned in your book, your audience, that they're drawn in a way
yes,
and become uh, examined by the text effectively.
absolutely, absolutely, that's right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Very good. So as you're doing this in your class, like what does your class look like? How do you set that up? What resources do you use? How do the students respond? Because, I'm looking at SLA Insights. How do we look at the teaching and learning of ancient languages and do it well? So for those who are listening or watching, what do you do? What does your class look like?
Yeah, so when you walk into our classroom, it doesn't look like a typical graduate study classroom. Stuffy desks with, uh, spots to write on. It's wide open. It's a kind of a long rectangle, and we've painted all of the walls with dry erase paint. So we can write on all the walls,
Okay.
and we use all the walls. Um, and we have a semicircle of chairs, so there's no desks, no tables, so there's no barrier between the student sitting and the student standing up and moving around. So we do lots of moving around, especially when we're doing this performance unit.
Mm-hmm.
But every class period, the students are up out of their seats moving around. And then we have several big cabinets filled with bins, plastic bins filled with stuffed animals, plastic food, plastic toys,
Awesome.
fabrics, costumes. We have a flannel graph board that we use to set up like the verb stem paradigm, and we hand those out to the students and they have to fill it out. And we have small individual whiteboards that we bought a big, huge whiteboard and cut them into pieces, and then we give those out to our students so that they can do interactive grammar drills when everyone's doing their own work, all that sort of stuff. But during the actual times where we're incorporating performance, well, let me just say, a lot of students, when they walk into our classroom, they feel like they got transported back to their kindergarten classroom.
Yes.
One of the first things that you see when you walk in is on the far left corner, there's a big cabinet, and on top of it is about an 8-foot long stuffed worm or caterpillar, multicolored caterpillar. And we use that in when we're doing Jonah 4
Okay.
and the
Yeah.
Tola'at, right?
Mm-hmm.
The worm
Right.
caterpillar that eats the bush
Mm-hmm.
growing over Jonah. So all that to indicate we incorporate a lot of play in our classroom, what I call the pedagogy of play, and that really the playfulness shapes the classroom culture, and I think the classroom culture is the foundation on which all of the communicative and the performative elements are built. And if you don't have that foundation of play, which play reduces anxiety, it opens students up to be vulnerable, to make mistakes, It's a low stakes environment, and lowering the stakes and lowering the anxiety empowers students to be more open, make mistakes, see failure as a part of the learning process, as opposed to something that says something about them as unable to learn. And so all of that is a part of establishing the culture of the classroom. And then everything else is built on that. So there's got to be a lot of trust between the students and myself and my co-teacher. All of our Hebrew courses are team taught by a man and a woman, to get multiple voices in the classroom. And so it's all built on trust. I kind of meandered around. I'm not sure if I actually answered your question or not,
Yes.
but
Yeah, for sure. But then how do you build in the performance piece?
yeah. Well, it happens in lots of different ways, in very subtle ways and more substantial ways. So one of the probably more substantial ways that we incorporate it is kind of like stepping stones or building blocks. The performance of the Binding of Isaac doesn't happen until 2/3 of the way through the second semester. So they've built facility with the language, confidence with each other. They're translating. Their vocabulary is quite large, and all of those sorts of things. But at the beginning of the first semester, we incorporate performance in a lot of ways. Say about a month in, we start engaging our primary text for the first semester, which is the book of Jonah.
Okay.
And we've divided Jonah into 7 sections, and each of those sections I kind of condensed into a short dialogue.
Okay.
And so there's 4 characters, each with 2 lines. And so we have our students internalize that dialogue, all 8 lines.
Uh-huh.
And then they come in groups of 4, and they rotate through and perform every part. And so they're wearing the costumes and whatnot. We've got all the things that make it playful and fun, and we very much encourage them to ham it up, be playful, be childlike, be goofy, be overly dramatic. These are not serious productions. The Binding of Isaac is serious, but these dialogues are very much play. And so we model those. We perform the dialogue for them ahead of time as a part of the learning process, helping them pronounce the words, understand the vocabulary, and all of those sorts of things. We also have so with the textbook that I wrote, there's also a whole bunch of companion audio-visual files. And there's audio files that help them learn the dialogues, and they can interact with them as different roles and all that. We have videos of former students perform the dialogue so they can sort of see it happen in real time. And then after the performances, we process the experience with them. What was that like for you? What did you learn? What do you might want to do different next time? Where did you sort of struggle and all that? But then the students know 8 lines of Hebrew phrases. So then we start using those lines that they're familiar with to analyze the grammar and do those kinds of things, so that the grammar analysis isn't happening in the abstract with a chart, but rather with words that they're familiar with, phrases that they're familiar with. So that kind of mimics the process that children go through when they're learning how to speak whatever their first language is. They learn all these sentences, then they go to school and figure out how to analyze them.
Right. So is there comprehension involved as they're memorizing the dialogue?
Yes, absolutely. Okay. Yeah. So we spend quite a bit of time in class to demonstrate all the words. And, we do that in Hebrew as much as possible. Mm-hmm. But we very much encourage them to, make sure they understand what they're saying. And also, they have to demonstrate to us through their performance that they understand what they're saying. So there's a difference between, the line that the sailor, the captain sailor says to Jonah, ma lecha nirdam, what's with your sleeping, you can say that, ma lecha nirdam, right? Which is just a straight saying, you're not communicating anything. Or ma lecha nirdam, what are you sleeping? There's a storm going on. And so we demonstrate all of that for them with different kinds of inflection and whatnot. And we also walk through and help them understand individual vocab words, not just as a whole line, but individual words. And the textbook has the dialogue printed in Hebrew, and then on the facing page has it translated in a very literal word by word translation, so that if there are certain words or phrases that are still unclear as they're making their final preparations, they can check it out in the English.
Yeah, that's great. And one of the reasons, as I talked to you earlier about, is one of the reasons I wanted you here at this point is because we're walking through some different options for how to incorporate output in the classroom. And I've talked with the audience about how we really don't want to do that rote memorization, mechanical drills where there's only one right answer. But you're dealing with memorization, but you're dealing with it on a comprehension kind of level, which is really an important distinction. So can you tell us a little bit more about that and how you see that contributing to the students' acquisition of the language?
Yeah. Well, I agree with you that you said earlier when we were talking about this that acquisition is a part of the foundation for comprehension is a part of the foundation of acquisition. And I totally agree with that. It doesn't help anyone to just recite memorized sounds that you have no idea what they mean, or to be able to read the text and pronounce the words correctly but have no idea what you're reading. And so we spend a good deal of time in class helping our students actually comprehend what they're doing, what they're hearing from us, and what we're asking them to say back to us. I think one of the really significant contributions that performance, or not, I want to be clear, I'm not just talking about performance in the terms of like a theatrical presentation of a script, but performative modes of interacting. That one of the gifts that it offers to language acquisition is the role of the body. That language is not just isolated to sound, of course. When we're talking, I don't know, 50% of what our communication is nonverbal. I don't know what the ratio is, but it's not 100% verbal, right? It's also all communication is embodied, or at least the most effective communication is embodied.
Yes.
And so performance really enhances the role of the body, or it increases the profile of the body in the communication event. And it forces you as a teacher to really think carefully about the role of your body in teaching and in communicating. And so we do, especially during the sections of class where we're trying to be just in Hebrew, that's why we have so many, stuffed animals and all these toys and stuff, so that we're able to be more comprehensive in communicating meaning, as opposed to just teaching them how to make certain sounds. And we want them as much as possible to associate the Hebrew sound with the meaning of either the action or the object, if it's an adjective or a noun, verb, whatever. We want them to connect the Hebrew sound with the meaning, as opposed to being facilitated by English, which it was for so many years.
Right, and kind of take out the middleman, as it were.
Exactly. Yeah,
very good. So with that, what do you see that's working well, and what challenges do you face in using this approach?
Yeah, well, I mean, one of the things that's working well, at least in our institution, is we've been teaching Hebrew this way for 18 years now, which is kind of remarkable.
That is
I
amazing.
I first started. I was sort of a student when our seminary switched over, and I took Hebrew the last time it was taught in the more traditional grammar translation approach. And then I went as a student with my faculty, with my professors to Israel to study with Randy Booth and the Biblical Language Center back in 2006. And we kind of got immersed in their process and learned from them 2006 and again in 2007, and came back and tried to implement what we learned there. And then over time, we kind of made it our own, but built on the foundation that they gave us. Um, so we've been doing it for 18 years now, and it's very much a part of the culture of the seminary now. And so students, I think they still come with some fear and trepidation of learning an ancient foreign language that has no correspondence with English, outside of shalom and hallelujah. Um, but so they come in with some trepidation, but they also come in with an enormous amount of excitement because they've heard how fun it is, and they've seen the classroom, and they've heard us singing songs, in the hallways, and they know it's really playful. So that's one really wonderful thing. I think another thing that's going well is that the larger guild of Hebrew professors are getting increasingly interested in communicative approaches, and it's seen as less peripheral. And I think younger faculty coming out of graduate school are just dissatisfied with the status quo of the grammar translation approach. They sense that there's more formative and formational and just interesting and fun ways of teaching the language that
Right.
actually don't decrease the effectiveness, but increase the effectiveness of the teaching. And students are more engaged. And so there's just so many benefits of doing it. And I think the increased awareness and familiarity and openness to it is really encouraging to me at the more level of the guild and SBL. Yeah, those are a few things I think that are going well. A challenge is, especially for a faculty member who has only been taught the grammar and translation approach, shifting to a more communicative, interactive approach can feel really intimidating.
Yes.
And the learning curve is steep. I can remember it wasn't that steep for me because I shifted only after 1 year of learning Hebrew as a student, and so it was I just took it all in stride. But I can remember my professors who were now students next to me when we went to Israel. They were just constantly hearing a word, translating it into English, and then trying to respond, and just like that it just took a lot more work for them. And so I think that's one challenge of how can we provide resources that allow anyone who's interested in doing this to, incrementally, slowly incorporate this kind of stuff into their classrooms. So I think I think Glossa House is doing an amazing job of providing resources for doing precisely that. And I think that my textbook can provide that kind of resource. And there's more and more stuff coming up that's doing that. That's really exciting.
Great. Thank you. Yeah, I completely
Yeah.
agree. Yeah, very good.
Well, and
Um,
your book is also super helpful in that regard. The book that you did with Glossa House, which is my foray into communicative teaching was not sort of formal in the academy. It was kind of intuitive, learned along the way, instinct. We had a big group of people that we were all, faculty members at the seminary trying to figure this out together. But your work sort of helped provide some language and theoretical foundation for that, and also kind of pushing, well, these are some areas where we need to continue to grow. And your book also super helpful in that regard.
I'm so glad. I'm so glad.
Yeah.
Great. So, one last question. What advice would you give to someone who wants to start this process? They've maybe done grammar translation all their life. That's how they learned. How do you get started? Where do you go to, even one or two steps that direction?
Yeah. The first advice that I would say is you can do this. You can absolutely do it. It's possible, it's doable, and it's fun. The second thing I would say is it'll take work. So count the cost ahead of time and prepare yourself. But the work is enriching. I would say the first thing I think you need to do is be willing to make mistakes publicly in front of your students. And
There
you
will
will
be many.
make mistakes all the time, right? And I think that, getting back to what we were talking about earlier about the culture of the classroom, if the professor is willing to be vulnerable and publicly make mistakes in front of their students, then their students are going to be much more willing to be vulnerable and make those mistakes in front of their classmates and their professor. And so I think that's just one way the professor can model the process of learning and invite the students into that process with them. How empowering for a student to receive that kind of invitation from a professor. So the willingness to be vulnerable and make mistakes is really key. And then I would say start small, incorporate a handful of things. Maybe start with a song. And, my YouTube channel has all sorts of professionally recorded songs that have the Hebrew, at the bottom and hand motions, and you can learn them very easily. You can just show them from the video, or you can learn them yourself and teach the students word by word and then phrase by phrase and verse by verse. Or start with like the dialogues, or maybe just start with the independent personal pronouns, and you say it out loud, have your students say it back, use hand motions, point, who, he, ani, anachnu, just like anything, simple stuff like that. Or incorporating simple games, grammatical games, into the classroom. Anything that's going to get them in their bodies, get them out of just this sort of anxious analytical mode of have to get the right answer, have to be perfect. Getting them playing, getting them exploring. I think any of those things can really be helpful.
Great. Well, thank you.
Oh, well, the last thing I'll say about that, I think there is one more really important thing, which is especially for classrooms where the focus is on the biblical text, internalize that whole passage in Hebrew. I internalized the whole book of Jonah, which was our first semester text, and then I can recreate the world of the vocabulary of the book of Jonah in the classroom. And secondly, this is maybe farther down the line for faculty members interested in this, but put the work in to get to develop your facility with verb conjugations. Because you don't want to just have to stick to the verbs in the forms that they appear in the texts that you're using. You want to be able to incorporate all the different, students and different gender, number combinations, etc. But internalizing the passage was a huge huge gift to me as a teacher because I was just so familiar with the text. It was just a lot easier to teach.
Right. That's great advice. Yeah. Thank you. Well,
Yeah.
thank you. Any last words before we sign off? It's been great talking with you and hearing how you do Hebrew, as well as performance and all kinds of things. So,
Yeah.
anything else you'd like to say?
Well, just thanks for the invitation, and to all those professors listening. Again, you can do this. You can include these elements in your classroom. If I can be helpful, you can find my email on the Western Theological Seminary faculty website. You can just Google Travis West Western Seminary, and be happy to interact with you.
Great. Well, thank you so much. It's been great talking with you and hearing about performance of the biblical text in Hebrew and learning Hebrew and all kinds of fun things. So we'll continue in the podcast discussing ways to incorporate output into your classroom, this being one great fun way to do it. And so I hope you can join me next week for the next episode. In the meantime, have a great week.
Hedatepantes egoimi iese, que tutastin zon Hellenisti. Hello everyone, I'm Jesse Orloff and this is Living in Greek. Semeron, thelo anaginoskin, ectes epistoles pros Thessalonikis duo. Dicniumi nun, ten periochen, kalos. Nun anaginosko. Pavlos και Silουανός και Τιμόθεος τε εκκλησία Θεσσαλονικαίων εν Θεώ Πατρί εμών και Κυρίω Ιησού Χριστό. Χάρις ημίν και ειρήνη από Θεού Πατρός και Κυρίου Ιησού Χριστού. Ευχαριστήν οφείλομεν το Θεό πάντοτε περί ημών, αδελφοί, καθώς αξιώνεστην, ότι υπεραυξάνει επίστης ημών και πλεονάζει αγάπη ενός εκάστου πάντων ημών εις αλλήλους, ώστε αυτούς εμάς εν ημίν εγκαυχάστε εν τες εκκλησίες του Θεού υπέρ τες υπομονές ημών και πίστεως εν πάσιν τους διωγμούς ημών και τες λήψεσιν ανέχεστε. Ένδειγμα τες δικαίας κρίσεως του Θεού, ιστο καταξιωθένε ημάς τες βασιλείας του Θεού, υπέρ και πάσχετε. Υπέρ δίκαιον παρά Θεό, ανταποδούνε τους θλίβουσιν ημάς θλίψιν, και ημίν τους θλιβωμένους άνεσιν μεθ' εμών εν τε αποκαλύψη του Κυρίου Ιησού απ' ουρανού μετ' αγγέλων δυνάμεως αυτού, εν φλογή πυρός, διδόντος εκδίκησιν τους με ειδώσει Θεόν, και τους με υπακούουσιν το Ευαγγελίο του Κυρίου εμών Ιησού, ούτινες δίκαιν τίσουσιν όλεθρον αιώνιον από προσώπου του Κυρίου και από τες δόξες τες ισχύος αυτού, όταν έλθε ενδοξασθένε εν τους Αγίους αυτού και θαυμασθένε εν πάσιν τους πιστεύσασιν, ότι επιστεύθε το μαρτύριον εμών εφ' ημάς, εν τε ημέρα εκείνε. Εις, και προσευχόμεθα πάντοτε περί ημών, ή να ημάς αξιώσε τες κλέσεως ο Θεός εμών, και πληρώσει πάσαν ευδοκίαν αγαθοσύνες, και έργων πίστεως εν δυνάμει, όπως ενδοξαστέ το όνομα του Κυρίου εμών Ιησού εν ημίν, και ημείς εν αυτό, κατά την χάριν του Θεού εμών και Κυρίου Ιησού Χριστού. Καλώς. Τούτες την το τέλος. Ευχαριστώ ημίν πάσιν. Και ασπασόμεθα, και απασπάζομαι ημάς. Ερώστε.
Interested in growing your ancient language skills but not sure where to start? Glossa House can help. From illustrated readers and short stories to lexicons and grammars, Glossa House offers a variety of resources for beginning, intermediate, and experienced ancient language learners. Head to glossahouse.com today. Glossa House, language resources for the global community.